Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. Geneva political scientist Dr. Daniel Warner kicks off the first in a three-part mini-series on the state of America today. Hello, everyone. What is it about America that holds our fascination? Is it its vastness, its bountifulness, its endless variation of geography, its mix of people, its brutal in parts history, its historic revolution against the British king, its great declaration of independence and wise written constitution, its paradoxes and contradictions, its enjoyable movies, its swinging jazz, the energy of its people in building a successful polity and giant economy over more than 200 years. There are even more questions that I could ask easily about what America means to non-Americans, let alone Americans, and I'm sure you could too. But in recent times, America seems to many of us who watch from a distance to be a country that has faltered, stumbled, a country not really at peace with itself, vast, energetic and talented as it undoubtedly is, because the health, whether economic, mental, or physical, of the globe's only superpower is important to the world, especially what we in the West call the free world. It's to be hoped and desired that America pulls itself together, and sooner rather than later, after the aberration of the recent period from 2016 to 2020. I'm fortunate to have the freedom to choose the topics and guests that I know interest me and I hope will interest you. On this occasion, and over the next few weeks, I'll be devoting 3 interviews to examine America today through the eyes of 2 American expatriates, one in Geneva and the other in London, and one American resident in the United States. What they have in common is that they're all friends of mine, the integrity of whose opinions I trust, and all Americans of a similar generation. They're Americans who've been around a long time and who can take a really long view. What makes them different from one another are their backgrounds and life experiences. 2 have been on my show before, though not recently. One is new. Some of you listening will know one or other, or even all 3 of them. With their help, we're going to look as carefully as time will allow at where America is today, how it got there. I mean, for example, the end of the Trump era, the beginning of Biden's, why the turmoil and rancor across the land that culminated in the defeat of Donald Trump on the 4th of November and in the 6th of January's deadly ransacking of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., why so many millions of Americans believe last November's election was stolen, to use the word of the man who lost, what was and still is seething in that country that caused that eruption. And given the predictions of the future are full of risk, always listen to the analysis of my 3 guests over the next few weeks as they give their best guess as to where America is going over the next 4, 8, 12 years, or even longer if they choose to cast their gaze that far ahead. Now, my first guest is Dr. Daniel Warner. Danny, to his friends, his distinctive Bronx accent gives him away, well, almost. Many of you know him or might think you know him, and I'm going to let him introduce himself before I start putting questions to him. Hello, Danny. Welcome back to the McKay interview. Briefly, tell the listeners who you are, but briefly.
Very briefly. Hello, Michael. Thank you for having me on. You can tell by my accent, I am a New Yorker, born and raised in the Bronx, graduate of the Horace Mann School and Amherst College. Upon graduating from Amherst with a degree in philosophy and religion, I did alternative service in 1968 to 1972 as a school teacher in the South Bronx and for 3 years in Harlem. I then left the United States, wound up in Switzerland, and taught for 14 years in a private school in the Swiss mountains, came down from the mountains in 1986 and got a PhD at the Graduate Institute, where I stayed for 25 years, coming to be the deputy to the director at one point, and at the same time, trained diplomats in 27 different countries for the Swiss government, mostly in the newly independent countries in the former Soviet Union in Central Asia and the Caucasus. During the same time, it might be interesting for some of you, I was a tennis pro for the Swiss Tennis Federation in charge of juniors in the canton of Valais.
Bravo,
Voila.
Danny. I didn't know that. That's amazing. Danny, well, listen, apart from the tennis pro, I'd love to talk to you about that another time, even though I don't play the game. You are essentially a political scientist, an academic. And so it's ideal to kick off this mini-series, though I have more questions than time will probably allow. But maybe I cut in on you a little bit too quickly there. Is there anything else you wanted to say about your biography?
Well, one small thing, that when I was in the United States, I was involved in politics, mostly with the Democratic Party. I was a speechwriter for Bobby Kennedy, so I do follow what happens politically in the United States with a particular interest.
Great. Danny, listen, the word context is an overworked word these days, but you and I are the same generation. We were both university college students in the mid to late 60s. You were in America, I was in England. Your country was in a war, unpopular war, which you lost. Was about to enter a political scandal, the Watergate, a few years later, which forced a corrupt president, Richard Nixon, to resign. Looking back, those were major events. But do they provide context, Danny, as to where America is today, or do we need to go back even further in history to understand? Please just cast some light on this and context.
Well, I make two comments, Michael. The first is, yes, 1968 was a definitive moment for the United States. There was civil rights. I had the fortune of being at school with a famous civil rights person named Bob Moses, and there was the war in Vietnam. And also there was the division in the United States about Richard Nixon. You mentioned Watergate. I mean, Nixon at least had the honor to resign. Otherwise, he would have been impeached. So you had a country that was severely divided at that time. Also, you see in the Trump presidency, going further back, a certain nostalgia for the position of the United States after World War II. In 1945, the United States was easily the dominant country in the world. And yet there are people, America first, who are hoping that the United States can go back to that situation. And in January 6th, when we saw the rioters, what I was reminded of was the McCarthy era, the extreme anti-communism in the United States in the 1950s, the John Birch Society, the Tea Party. The Proud Boys, to me, are part of that. And Nixon had someone with him who also worked for Donald Trump, named Roy Cohen. And that's a certain part of the United States which has not gone away, and I don't think will ever go away.
But just for the benefit of, relatively speaking, younger listeners who might not be familiar with the McCarthy time, although the McCarthy era is one of those sort of hooks that people tend to put into conversation. But just briefly, what happened there? Was there violence during that time, or was it just a very angry time in American history?
Well, it was, I mean, Joe McCarthy was a senator from the Middle West who made his reputation saying that there were communists all over. And again, it was people who were determined to have the United States as the most important country, America first. And those people who were against that, what Trump would call the globalist, were suspected of being anti-American. And that era, to some extent, has continued with the Proud Boys in the sense that you're either with us or against us. And that kind of binary distinction was important during the McCarthy era as communist, anti-communist, and now I think with Trump also, are you an American, a nationalist, a patriot, or are you a so-called globalist?
Mm. You must have seen what happened on the 6th of January in the Capitol building. Would you have called that a pivotal day? I mean, would you have used the word insurrection? Is that an exaggeration? I mean, how did you see that, given the fact that 5 people died on the premises?
I was very surprised when the videos came out after showing the level of violence. But again, I've had certain experiences in the United States in the 1960s when I went down south for certain civil rights activities, and in other places, actually in Idaho once, where I was attacked. Perhaps my hair was too long and perhaps my accent was too northern. I do remember in 1967, just outside Washington, D.C., being called a damn Yankee. That goes back to the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, South versus the North. So there is a certain animosity in the United States, and there is always a certain violence that we've seen, a certain cowboy culture that has not totally gone away and comes up from time to time if there's a particular person who calls upon people, and there is a certain kind of charisma about Trump as there was about Joseph McCarthy.
So this question is a sort of corollary to that interesting answer, Danny. On the face of it, America, and this is really a typical question of a foreigner, a non-American, but you'll understand why I ask it. On the face of it, America appears to be a homogeneous country, united by its great constitution, its flag, oath of allegiance, common language, values, the so-called American dream. Or is this all superfluous now, no longer relevant? I mean, during the recent election, the country seemed to be split into 2, 3, or 4. Is that split by generation, by race, by religion, by geography, by social class? I mean, what's really going on over there?
Well, the word homogeneous certainly doesn't apply to the United States. Historically, we've called the United States a melting pot. That is, my grandparents came from Eastern Europe, people come from Latin America, come from all over, and they become part of, they assimilate into the United States.
Right.
What we see now is called the salad bowl. In other words, people are not coming together. One of the reasons for that is the enormous demographic growth of people of color. And part of the Proud Boys, part of January the 6th was a certain form of white supremacy, white racism, because the demography of the United States is saying that in 10, 15, 20 years, people of color will be perhaps as much as 50% of the American population. So the notion of assimilation now, there is a reaction, a backlash against that, with more and more people coming from Latin America and more African American blacks becoming more prominent. In a sense, January 6th can be seen as a reaction to the presidency of Barack Obama.
I see, I see. Okay, well, what I had in my mind was to ask you about America's tectonic plates, if I could use that analogy. Are they moving farther apart? You mentioned race, but my observation from a distance is that the mixture of colors in the crowd of demonstrators and the Black Lives Matter marches and against the George Floyd killings was much more mixed than I seem to remember seeing back in the 60s when I watched these demonstrations on television. I mean, is there a change in the public sentiment regarding the way race is regarded by the younger, and when I say the younger generation, the people under 40?
I think there is a much more of an integration in the United States. After all, in the 1940s and 50s, there was segregation in the South, even in the northern cities. I had the privilege of teaching in Harlem for 3 years. I was the only white person coming to school in the morning, and people used to turn to me and say, a visitor from another planet. So there were all of these ghettos, but I think as time has gone on, there's been more integration in schools, so the younger generation is easier with people from a different color. And also you have marriages now. You look at the Vice President Kamala Harris, she has a white husband. Those are the things that were illegal in the United States, in states like Virginia and other states in the South, and that has passed. So I think the younger generation is better in terms of people of color, but there is a certain nostalgia for this kind of white domination, and I don't think we should forget that.
And just address for a moment, with your sort of political science hat on, the widening gap between rich and poor. America is not the only country to be experiencing this, but were Donald Trump's promises to blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt kept? Did their jobs actually come back over those 4 years, or was that basically a myth, a chimera?
No, I think it's a myth because, I mean, industry has now moved a lot of it to Asia. And I think those people will have to be trained in other kinds of jobs. But the difference in wealth with those people who've made billions and billions is something we've never seen. Even the Rockefellers, the Fords, and that Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century, the differences now between the rich and the poor are much greater, and it's more difficult for people on the lower scale to grow. That's one of the reasons that Biden has been very enthusiastic about unions, because he sees that the blue collar workers have to get more money. He's trying to increase the minimum wage to $15, but there is this problem. But every time you say the government should do something about job creation, certain people will yell socialism. And I think the end of the Soviet Union in 1989 has had a tremendous effect, leading to a certain euphoria that you see capitalism is the best and the government should not intervene.
You know, can you just address for a moment the thing that puzzles many, a lot of non-Americans living abroad, and I suppose many Americans too? It's the whole aspect of America's relationship with guns. It runs through the country's history, though the US is certainly not the only Western country with violence in its past, but not many free countries, Danny, have more guns than citizens, and army-grade weapons at that. Can America rid itself of this deadly immaturity? And does America have the will to do it?
The image of the cowboy is extremely important for the United States. And I give this to you, Michael, because you'll understand easily. The greatest advertising campaign in the history of the world was the Marlboro Man.
I never
And
worked for the company, though.
The Marlboro Man on his horse with the gun out in the Wild West. And that image has been with the American people since the beginning, and to some extent is still there, even though the Marlboro Man died of cancer, the original one. The image of out in the wilderness with those guns is part of American culture.
You're going to tell me that that sort of trumps, forgive the analogy, Randolph Scott and John Wayne, Danny.
Yeah, that's there.
Okay.
That's there.
Okay. Look, we have to close shortly, but let's just talk about the Trump legacy. And for those who watch it on TV, the significance of the recent vote in the Senate not to impeach him for the second time, and Mitch McConnell's damning, though thoughtfully crafted closing speech, which I thought was a masterpiece of speech writing. And then describe, please, what those who inherit or wish to inherit Trump's mantle in 4 years' time have really been bequeathed. And finally, it's a long-winded question, tied inescapably to that question is, what is the future of the Republican Party, in your opinion? Has it been corrupted and weakened beyond repair over the past 4 years? How do you see it, Danny?
Well, I mean, to begin with, Trump did get 74, 75 million votes.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. And some of the comments made about him I find very touching. One, someone said, he speaks like us. And to some extent, there is an anti-intellectualism and anti-elitism about that. Clinton, Obama, Harvard, Yale, intellectual elitist. And to some extent, Trump surprisingly wound up speaking for the common man. And here I think Biden made an interesting point once where he said, you know, I went to the University of Delaware, I'm like the common people. Whereas I think Trump followers are resentful of the kind of elitism of Obama and Clinton and people who went to top universities in the United States. As far as the Republican Party is concerned, the Republican Party has always been a white party, a party of big business and Wall Street. Now it appeals more to law and order, and it appeals to people who historically have been Democrats, union people, lower class, blue collar workers. And that means that there's a schism now within the Republican Party. It used to be that the Democratic Party had the big tent with all different kinds of levels of people. Now it's the Republican Party, as you pointed out, Mitch McConnell's torturous speech that I think a psychologist has to look at it. The question is, can the Wall Street typical business people get along with the law and order people, the Proud Boys, and et cetera? I'm not sure, but I do remind you that in the election in 2020, the Republicans gained seats in the House, didn't lose that much in the Senate, but across the United States in local elections, the Republican Party did very well. So lots of what's going on in January 6th and after will deal with the election in 2022, where the Republicans are hoping they can take back the House and the Senate.
Thanks, Danny. It's very interesting. Last question, Danny. What does Joe Biden need to do now and by 2024, and can he, and what will it take? And then lastly, it's a big question to end with, but we've got a bit more time. What about foreign policy? The USA's leadership of the free world, looking ahead from 2021, and its relations with its economic competitor, China.
I mean, Biden is extremely well prepared to be president. He was in the Senate for 36 years. He was vice president for 8 years, and he has a clear vision of where the United States should be. To some extent, he accepts the globalized world that we're living in. We see what he did with the Paris Agreement. We see that he's come back to the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. All of these things show that he is, to some extent, a globalist. On the other hand, he has the pandemic, he has the economic problems. So the question of foreign policy will not be the highest thing on his agenda. But I do think he will be less confrontational than Trump. Trump is a win-lose guy. He's a typical New Yorker like me. You either are first or you're not there. I think he's much more willing to compromise and to negotiate. He's much more multilateral. I mean, in Geneva, people are thrilled that Biden is there, the Human Rights Council, World Health Organization, et cetera. So I think in terms of China, there will always be competition, but I don't think it's a question of confrontation. And I think that through the multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, Human Rights Council, there will be certain forms of understanding between the two countries. But I think it will be less belligerent than Trump.
Danny, thanks so much. It's been absolutely fascinating and enlightening. I mean, we could easily do this again. Maybe we sit together if we make it through the 4 years, and we do it at the end of Biden's first term. But my guest today has been Dr. Danny Warner, former deputy to the director of the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. Thank you again, Danny, very much.
Thank you, Michael. A pleasure.